Hey, good to see you. Thanks for coming. This is another episode of Wireframe, and today we're going to be talking about all about wraps. All about wraps. Wow, that's more of a mouthful than I planned. So it was a long weekend, July 4th here in the States. We had a couple of days off that we were seeing some explosions in the air and seeing family and friends and all that kind of good stuff. I had quite a bit of a weekend. And I should have actually, in retrospect, updated the Wireframe site to include the new font that's being used on the site in order to update the imagery, but I didn't do that. I totally forgot. I'm making a note of it, and I'll update it when I have some time. Unfortunately, I don't have some time because I have some other things cooking. One of those things is a blog post that is about wrapping in a different way than what we're going to talk about today. In fact, the way that we're talking about it today really doesn't have much to do about the idea of wrapping as much as it has the idea to do about, well, we'll get into it. And I also have a couple of other things to mention in terms of jobs and events. Unfortunately, the event that's here in New York is completely sold out. But again, we'll talk about that because you should absolutely subscribe to that event. I'm just getting ahead of myself. Let's get into the topic, which is about wraps. And specifically, it all started with this idea called shrink wrap. So let me explain this for a little bit. So shrink wrap was, or still is really, a way that we wrap physical products in this like cellophane, transparent wrapping film that helps with like the shipping process, make sure that the product is intact when it gets to the end user. And it's one of the ways that we secure to make sure that our products are delivered to the user as intended. Okay. This is where the term came from for the ideas of browse wrap and click wrap. And there's other wraps when it comes to that too. But effectively, you've definitely seen one of these two things, if not both of them, in your daily life on the internet. And this all has to do with accepting legal terms and conditions digitally on your device. So they are effectively the same thing with a very key difference. Browse wrap is the idea of saying that when you are browsing a particular site, you moving forward to another kind of section in the site is agreeing to terms just because you are moving through the site. So it's a very kind of like passive, like, hey, well, if you're going to continue, then you agree to the terms, right? And you would hit some link that says, of course, and you would go to the next place. Click wrap is a little bit more specific, where you end up having to effectively hit the checkbox or some other more complicated version before moving on to, whatever kind of system that you're working on. And the difference is actually very important because typically the browse wrap pattern doesn't hold up legally in court, while the click wrap direction would, typically, right? And, going off of legal cases, anything is possible based on other factors that are in there. In fact, we're going to talk about a couple of those cases. But generally speaking, the click wrap approach, which is effectively that checkbox, and a link to the T's and C's or other legal documents that are important is the most effective way of making sure that you are covered legally for a person using your service. Okay? There's other kinds of wrapping, but those are the two major ones. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up and the reason why I researched into this kind of world a little bit is mostly because of checkbox patterns. Generally speaking, when we have like a checkbox pattern, most of the time you have a checkbox and then you have some text that's next to it. And usually that text that's next to it is also interactive to the checkbox, right? You can imagine like maybe a card that's very complex in terms of its layout, has a checkbox in it, and then has, you know, an image in it maybe, or maybe it has some text or so on and so forth, right? So the important thing is that when you click that content, that triggers the checkbox to be clicked, typically speaking. In fact, there was a bit of discussion about if the label should be clicked, if the checkbox also gets interactive. I think Devin posted that on the Twitter verse, which I got linked to because I wouldn't be on Twitter normally. And it was a very interesting conversation. The general gist is that everyone kind of expected, in most cases, that the checkbox being clickable was not expected. We would expect instead for the text next to it to be clickable, generally speaking. There was a little bit of toss-up when it came to more complex layouts that checkbox was associated with, but the fundamental thing is that the checkbox alone wasn't the only target area. The additional text next to it would also be a target area, even if it's minimal. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up is because that text is meant to be only interactive to the checkbox. It's not meant to be dually interactive. And what that means is that you shouldn't be putting a link in a label for the checkbox, right? And this is a general kind of usability practice, best practice that we would normally see, where you don't have mixed interactions on top of a particular element, right? So we've talked about this with cards all the time, where you have lots of different buttons on a particular card, and then the card itself is interactive. Like, that's typically a no-no in usability and accessibility terms, because it makes it difficult to understand what's meant to happen when you click a particular item. Now, bringing this all the way back to what we were talking about for click wraps, typically when you see those terms and conditions on the bottom of this sign-up page, you'll have the check mark, right? And then sometimes what you'll see is the label, and then inside of that label would be a link to the terms and conditions, right? That's potentially a bad pattern, depending on how you set that up. Because in the example that Devin was showing earlier, that means that the better pattern for this would be to have the checkbox, then a label that says agrees to terms and conditions, right? So this is what that means. That label means you agree to terms and conditions. And then somewhere in that vicinity, a link that has a relationship to the checkbox, but not so much that when you click the link, it clicks the checkbox, right? Those interactions need to be separate. And I would assume from a usability purposes, actually that link should be first, because effectively you're expecting that the person would be reading the terms and conditions, when unfortunately no one else really does. But you would have that link first, such that a person could read the terms and conditions and then check the box, right? So in that order would be more important. So just a very small part of user experience that people don't necessarily think about. It's usually like, you know, afterthought, and even the cases of like legal, right? Legal, of course, is going to expect the click wrap kind of pattern typically, but just the order in which those things operate, and on top of which legal doesn't necessarily know, you know, a mixed interaction pattern being bad. They'll just be like, nope, throw a link in there and then we'll be good, right? So really interesting kind of concept in there. I'm going to go to a post that's at ironclad.com that's talking about browse versus click wrap. And they have a couple of other nice examples that I'm going to go over. in a minute. So here's the post here. Again, it's in the Ironclad journal, I suppose, and it's click wrap versus browser wrap. What is the difference? And it talks about the differences that I kind of already mentioned already, generally speaking. And it talks about the similarities between them. They're both presenting online agreements, both legal under a couple of different acts, and then they're used by companies everywhere. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're good. But here are the differences. So it talked about the differences before. Click wrap is requiring more from you and your users. And when they say more, they're just talking about a checkbox. They're really not saying much more. In fact, there's a way for you to do a browse wrap that's a little bit more legally standing, which is effectively something disruptive that causes the user to not be able to continue unless they move forward by saying, yes, I agree, almost like a double confirmation pattern. But click wrap is a lot better. And now in the enforceability section of this is the really interesting part, which talks about a couple of cases. Now, the first case they talk about here is, I'm going to go back to me so I could just be focused on this here. The first case is apparently the original click wrap case. This is Spect versus Netscape, and apparently Netscape included a hyperlink to their agreement at the bottom of the web page where users downloaded software, but because this failed to give users proper notice of Netscape's terms were deemed unenforceable. So in summary for that particular thing, right, the agreement was at the bottom of the page, but people could still do whatever they wanted to do on Netscape, right? It wasn't really telling anyone that you had to read the terms and conditions before moving forward, right? You would just have it on the page as something you could happen upon, which is not good, right? You have to agree to the terms for it to be legally standing before moving forward. So that's kind of what sparked this whole idea. The next one they have here is Seguros versus TransUnion Corp. And they used something called a scroll wrap on the screen. Now this is the first time I've ever heard of scroll wrap. I'm assuming, and don't quote me on this, that scroll wrap basically means that you would have to scroll and maybe finish scrolling in order to continue. But they had a scroll wrap on the screen and required users to check a box labeled I accept and continue before creating the account. The court acknowledged checking the box to accept the terms of the agreement was sufficient, but the notice surrounding the checkbox didn't notify users of the existence of this contract. So this is what I was talking about earlier, right? The link to the terms and conditions needs to be in proximity to that checkbox. And it seems like in this particular case, it wasn't in proximity. It was basically maybe somewhere else, right? That wasn't necessarily clear, right? So the important thing that they're talking about here is that these agreements can only be enforced if they provide actual notice to the users of the agreement, right? The user has to admit that they had knowledge of the terms, and the website has to show that they provided user with the online terms, okay? Now there's one more example they have here. It's Southwest Airlines versus BoardFirst, and BoardFirst had actual knowledge of Southwest's terms because of Southwest had a cease and desist letter that they sent them. But apparently Southwest's browse wrap agreement wouldn't have been enforceable if it wasn't for the cease and desist letter. So I don't know enough about this case. From my assumption in this description, there was some sort of a cease and desist letter that basically said BoardFirst was violating some terms and services, meaning that because that letter was sent directly to them, they are now familiar with the terms and services existing, and therefore was now then enforceable. That, of course, depends on earlier situations where if BoardFirst was doing something with Southwest Airlines, somehow avoiding the terms and services, terms and conditions, maybe that would have been something different. But apparently this one was a little bit rocky overall. But the bottom line here is that click wrap follows best practices, browse wrap does not, right? So ultimately, when you're providing a terms and conditions for your users, you'll absolutely need some sort of checkbox that exists there such that it satisfies half of effectively the click wrap legal standing. But the other thing that you absolutely need is a link or just the terms and conditions right there, right, so that they can't move forward, right? So we've seen that maybe a little bit in like app installs, right, where you'll have to scroll the entire terms and conditions before it allows you to accept and go next, right? So that's probably the scroll wrap situation again. But that little UI lockup that has the checkbox, the accept label that effectively tells you what that checkbox is all about, and a link to those terms and conditions, potentially the link being first, should be the most important kind of lockup in a legal sense for your experience, especially in cases of applications and other services, right? So that's really what I'm talking about today. Probably a very nerdy topic overall, but something to really dive into and think about, like outliers in your system or guidelines that you should provide to your users in terms of, you know, order of operations or interactive elements that are potentially near each other or hopefully not nested. So things to consider there. All right, let's get into some of the stuff that's going on this particular week. So the first thing I want to mention, the question is back this week, and it is a stacked question because not only is there one host, but there's actually two. So here's the new question for this week. It's episode 57 coming up here. And we have Ishmael and Steve, who are working on a book alongside Nate and Audrey-Lian, I think. I'm probably mispronouncing that, unfortunately. But Ishmael and Steve are great. Steve and I know each other, of course, from doing lots of nerdy design systems work. And we've chatted on a couple of different things. He's very into design tokens. He actually, I think he made a translator for the new spec for design tokens. And then Ishmael has a design tokens book that's out already that we actually talked about book writing because I was having some trouble, which I still am technically having some trouble with publishing, although I have some feelers on that are potentially moving forward nicely. More on that later. But anyway, the question is all about flexibility versus rigidity, right? And this is a really good topic in design systems because when we talk about flexibility and rigidity, from a systems perspective, there really should expect some rigidity in there because this is meant to have a cohesive experience, right? Some regular meeting expectations for users. However, this is also a part of design where folks are expecting some creativity or some expression on top of that system and basically the give and take that happens in there. So it should be a really interesting conversation overall. Going to try to make this, I say that every time and I end up getting busy, but this sounds like a really good one, and also having more than one host is new to this whole thing as far as I know. So will be really cool. Next thing I want to mention is unfortunately sold out. This is the UX Content Design New York City meetup, which is an excellent meetup. I can't stress, I'm actually very jealous of this meetup about how many people show up to this and how great the group is, and how it's definitely a nerdy thing because these are all UX writers and maybe some technical writers in there, content strategists, all those kinds of folks. And last time it was at, oh God, whose office was that? I don't remember. I don't remember whose office it was. It was like six weeks ago or so, I think. Or maybe it was just last month. But anyway, I'll be at this here. This is going to be at Figma's offices on 23rd Street over by by Flatiron. And I expect it to be another good one. Unfortunately, like I said, it is sold out. But I absolutely recommend that you follow the UX Content Design NYC meetup if you are in New York on Eventbrite for their next events. Absolutely great team that are putting together some stuff over here. And like I said, I'm jealous of their success. In terms of jobs this particular week, the only one I know about is this one, which is by Knapsack. So if you don't know, Knapsack is a product that is out there to support design system teams. And they were originally looking for a UX engineer, but they are now changing that job description to be closer to a product designer with an engineering background. I didn't read the description in this particular thing here, but this is I'm assuming still like a UX engineer, but I'm also going to assume that they're probably looking for someone who's more on the Figma side of stuff. So he, that person would understand more about what Figma's doing in terms of, the expectations for designers there, with some engineering chops such that they can maybe make a plugin or something like that. I really don't know. You could read it yourself and get into it and potentially apply. They're a really good bunch. They're the folks that do some of the leadership meetups here in New York, which there will be one, I think, in October coming up, which I'm looking forward to. Hopefully no surgeries for me then. I missed the last one because of my surgery at the same day, unfortunately. But looking forward to that one later on this year. But that's all I know in terms of things happening this particular week. And look out for that blog post that's about text wrapping. That's going to be coming out really soon, because I'm down a rabbit hole about making a text component, and one of those things potentially is the way that text is laid out, in particular of a container. So look forward to that. But if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, leave them in the comments down below. Play nice in there, and I'll see you next time. Bye.